Welcome to the VO2 Lounge. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about the ever controversial topic of transgender female athletes and their place in sport, and whether that is within the male/open category or is that within the female category. If you are new to the podcast, then welcome, and I hope you enjoy this episode. If you're a return customer, then why not follow if you haven't already and leave a rating on the pod platform of your choice. It's the best way to help the podcast grow. I think before going any further, it is important for you, the listener, to understand what my standpoint is currently on trans females within sport. Personally, obviously, I have no gripe with them continuing to compete in sport, but I do think that should remain within the male/open category, or if essentially remaining within what their sex assignment at birth was and remaining in that category. It's not to say that when producing this podcast I have only focused on the argument for trans females competing in the male category, but just that it's good to know that that's where I'm coming from, and that way you can make your own decision on what I am delivering. I think it's also important to mention that I will also state now that if I refer to a female or a male, I am referring to their biological sex at birth, and if I'm referring to a transgender male or female, I will state that in the delivery, just to make it easier. Now, if you have been living under a rock and want to know what the issue here is, well, let's start from the beginning. Males or biological males enjoy physical performance advantages over females within competitive sport. The sex-based segregation into the male and female sporting categories does not account for transgender people who experience a difference between their biological sex and their experienced gender identity. Historically, for example, the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, determined criteria by which transgender women may be eligible to compete in the female category, requiring a total serum testosterone level to be suppressed below 10 nanomole per litre for at least 12 months prior and during competition. This has been the predominant and still is one of the predominant methods, theories / justifications for allowing transgender females into the female category within sport. The question is, and what this episode aims to answer, or should I say highlights, is how the difference in biological characteristics between biological males and females affects sporting performance, and assesses whether evidence exists to support the assumption that testosterone suppression in transgender women removes male performance advantage and thus delivers fair and more, to some extent in some sports, safe competition. I think a good way of starting this discussion is looking at the current state of affairs. So let's go over some of the guidelines / regulations / rules, whatever you want to call them, from various governing bodies of different sports. So, World Rugby, it was really easy to find out. It effectively just types in World Rugby Transgender, and there was their statement. Now, they state that transgender women may not currently play women's rugby. Why? The question, because of the size, force and power producing advantages conferred by testosterone during puberty and adolescence, and the resultant player welfare risks this creates. Clearly for World Rugby, it's a contact sport. There is issues with concussion within male-on-male rugby, biological male-on-male rugby. So it would be wise to assume that given the developmental differences between males and females, that these player welfare risks could be increased by allowing transgender women to compete within the women's rugby category. Now, what is good to note there is the fact that they are not saying transgender women can't compete in rugby. It's saying within the women's category, which is, I think, a key takeaway from these. World Triathlon was a bit harder. I did have to look through the regulations a little bit, but it was there. Now, they've stated that the transgender athlete must have a circulating level of testosterone, which is 2.5 nanomole per litre for 2 years, and must not have competed in the male category for at least 4 years, based on the level of testosterone circulating in cis women of 0.12 to 1.79 nanomole per litre. So they've allowed a higher amount of testosterone circulating in the body. So their World Triathlon still want to allow them to compete. They're giving them some guidelines, and that would suggest that they believe that testosterone suppression is enough to warrant fair and safe competition. Obviously, unlike World Rugby, they don't have to be concerned about player welfare in the sense of there is no human-on-human contact. It's a non-contact sport, but they do have to worry about the sport being fair. So clearly, either they believe it's fair, or they don't want the possible backlash. However, British triathlon, right? British triathlon. So still the same sport, just you could argue a lower down governing body, just the national governing body. Under section 7, which is competitive activity, then 7.1, which is categories, where a race/event organizer provides a competitive activity, they must provide the following outlined below. Categories of competition: the female category and the open category. They must provide both. And then in 7.2, the application to compete in a female category, right? This is the key bit. Only people who are the female sex at birth will be eligible to compete in the female category. So they've gone all the way of saying, regardless of testosterone suppression, you may not compete within the female category unless you were, your sex at birth was female. So there you go. The WAC, or World Athletics Committee, they voted to ban transgender women from elite female competitions if they have undergone male puberty. In a decision, the governing body said that had been taken to protect the future of the female category. It to me, especially that kind of line of protecting the female category, to some extent, you could even look at it as, you know how doping and in running super shoes have somewhat tainted records, in the sense that you don't know if the record hasn't been broken or has been broken because of doping, or whether it will never be broken again because there was too much doping in the past, or super shoes, whether there has actually been an advancement in training or physiology or whatever, or whether it's just shoes. So that kind of would happen really if you had an influx of male at birth, now transgender females competing. You'd suddenly have loads of records broken, which we will move on to later. But for now, we'll continue on the track of what everyone is saying. The IOC, as I've said before, the International Olympic Committee, currently allows the governing bodies of individual sports to set their own rules around the inclusion of trans athletes. So they've done similar to what World Triathlon did, in the sense that they've towed the line. They've gone even less far as World Triathlon. They've just gone, we'll let everyone else decide. And then the FA, Football Association, or whatever the full name is, FA Rule J3 on mixed football: any players playing in the age range above the under 16 age range must be of the same gender. However, an individual may be eligible for participation in their affirmed gender. This will be subject to approval of the FA on a case-by-case basis. The clearance procedure is set out below. That's obviously referring to their documentation. You can find that online pretty easily, but that's kind of highlighting that they deem, obviously, football, I don't know if it's considered contact, but it's not contact in the same description as rugby, and they're kind of highlighting the fact that, I mean, rugby at really young ages, you can often have mixed genders in the same, or mixed sexes in the same games, because clearly the FA is identifying the fact that this could be twofold. In general, that the female that at pre-pubescent ages, the gap is lesser / they're on a pre-equal playing field, and given that female sport in general around football and sport in general isn't as prevalent, maybe at the older as you get older, there begins opportunity for teams. But at the younger ages, if you don't allow girls to compete with boys, then maybe there's not enough of them really to have good competitive sport. So it allows for a development pathway. But then as soon as those advantages become too great, they segregate, but they're still offering to have the door open with a case-by-case basis of allowing transgender females to compete within the female category. So that is the governing bodies that I went over. That gives you kind of a baseline of understanding of where we are today. You may have only just heard it kind of in the news or amongst friends, but that is, to my best understanding, as of the 8th of July 2023, that is currently the state of affairs. Okay, so now we're going to get into the part of the episode where I start talking more about what studies have to offer around transgender females within sport. So now we can see from what I've just said that there's a bit of a clear picture emerging, and this is that these governing bodies believe there is a male advantage, hence why they are not allowing these transgender females to compete within it or requiring them to suppress testosterone. So what isn't clear is why some believe there is no place for transgender females in the female category at all, while others see a possible case-by-case place for them, and others with enough testosterone suppression. They should compete within a female category in that instance. For example, if they just suppress testosterone enough. Now, they must be getting this information from somewhere, so let's start with the biological basis for the advantage males possess over females within sport. So, the physical divergence between males and females begins during early embryogenesis, when bipotential gonads are triggered to differentiate into testes or ovaries, the tissues that will produce sperm in males and ova in females, respectively. Now, there are, in rare instances, differences in sex development, also known as DSD. The Olympic Committee has a DSD policy. Now, this does occur, and the typical progression of male to female development is then disrupted. This is a really complicated subject. I started looking into it briefly. Didn't feel like this was the place to go into it in depth because it would probably consume a lot of the episode. But arguably the most relevant to sport is the case where a female is born with an XY rather than an XX chromosome and has internal testes that can result in them having abnormally high testosterone for a female, right? That is the key thing. So they can have abnormally high testosterone. So they will be identified as female at birth, yet possess this high testosterone level. So, testosterone is the main talking point of this debate from a biological advantage standpoint. So it's important to know what it is and how it differs between males and females. Now, it's important to say here that it's not the only talking point, which we'll kind of get onto in a bit, the philosophical point of what is fair, what is right, what is just, human rights, and all that. But from a biological standpoint, the key metric / lever is talking about testosterone. So, testosterone is responsible for the development of primary sexual development, which includes testicular descent, spermogenesis, enlargement of the penis and testes, and increasing libido. For sport, we are more interested in the secondary sex development, which are its anabolic effects, which include growth spurts during puberty and skeletal muscle growth, as testosterone stimulates protein synthesis. Testosterone also stimulates erythropoiesis, which, sorry for the pronunciation, which results in a higher hematocrit in males versus females, great for carrying more oxygen. If you've heard my episodes on VO2 max or altitude training, you will understand, or if you're a keen follower of cycling, especially through the Armstrong kind of eras, you will be well read, understood, familiar with hematocrit and its effects. But simply improved oxygen carrying capacity. What is key for aerobic exercise? It's in the name, aerobic, oxygen. So if you're able to carry more of that to the working muscles, clearly an advantage. So testosterone levels tend to drop with increasing age. Because of this, men tend to experience a decrease in testicular size, a drop in libido, lower bone density, muscle mass decline, increased fat production, and decreased erythropoiesis, which leads to a possible a level of anemia. These are all non-favorable characteristics of sport, and often conditions that women can suffer with, simply because of that fact of the protective nature and enhancing nature of testosterone. For reference, so that if you hear numbers anywhere or want to understand the magnitude of which the difference in males and females is, for reference, a healthy male between the age of 18 and 40 will have a range of 7.7 nanomole to 29.4 nanomole. In comparison to females with an upper normal range of 1.7 nanomole, I'm talking upper normal range. That is 4.5 times lower than the worst case male. Obviously, you can get males outside of that case, but the worst case male, and even a best case female against best case male, is 17 times lower than men. So you can now imagine when you've got average men and average women / uppercase men and lowercase women or whatever, that the difference is gigantic and is, as we move on, going to provide basis for the difference in male and female sporting ability. Now, a little fun fact. While estrogens are considered the dominant sex hormone in women, in fact, serum testosterone levels in women are higher than estrogen levels most of the time. The exception is during the pre-ovulatory and mid-luteal phases of the menstrual cycle, when androgen and estrogen levels are similar. So, yeah, a little fun fact for people. So getting back on track then, this increased exposure that males have to testosterone during post-puberty results in a large number of physical differences. Roughly speaking, this includes the following. So, body composition. So, lean body mass is 45% greater in males than females. Fat percentage is 30% lower. Muscle mass distribution lower in upper body. We've got 33% more in the in the lower body. And then 40% greater muscle mass in the upper body. Strength, grip strength, we're talking 57% increase. Knee extension peak torque, 54%. Now, you've got some differences in bone geometry, like the femur length is 9.4% longer. humerus length 12%, radius length 14.6%, pelvic width relative to pelvic height 6.1% lower in men. Why are these still important? Because looking at it easily, if you've got a longer bone structure, then even without the muscle being relative to total body mass or body size being larger, there will be more of it because it's covering a greater distance. You've got tendon properties where the force potential of it is 83 times greater. Stiffness is 41% greater. Absolute values for VO2 max 50% higher. Relative, so then now absolute and relative. Obviously, VO2 max is a key performance factor, but it's kind of like the gateway, the entry. It's like, okay, if your VO2 max is 50, you're not going to be a pro cyclist. But if your VO2 max is 90, it doesn't mean you're going to win the Tour de France. Now, relative is kind of useful because this is 25% higher, and obviously relative is taking into account body weight. So the 50% greater in absolute values, which doesn't take in body weight, is probably artificially high because men are just heavier in general. Respiratory function, so pulmonary, maximal pulmonary ventilation is 48% greater. Cardiovascular function, left ventricular mass, main pumping chamber, 31% greater. Cardiac output at rest, 22% greater. Maximal cardiac output, 30% greater. And stroke volume at rest, 43% greater. Now, these come from various different sources, but that is why I'm saying these are, roughly speaking, even if these are all inflated by 10% relative to what they currently are, it's still just showing that clearly in men there is, males, there is this, just all these functions that all relate heavily to sport are greater / larger. Being more sport specific, in the performance gaps, rowing, swimming and running show a approximately 11 to 13% difference with low variation across individual events within each of these categories. The performance gap increases in things like track cycling, where it's about 16%, with a higher variation in events from 9% in a 4,000 meter pursuit to 24% in the flying 500 meter time trial, probably attributed to the sheer peak power required. So I think the general thing you're looking at here is the longer an event is, the lower the advantage is, whereas the shorter the event is and the greater contribution of just physical force production. Like in a 500 meter time trial, this is pure a 4,000 on a bike is maximal, but now we're really talking how much force can you generate. And clearly men, like biological males, are going to have a greater advantage in that. The average performance gap is around 18% in jumping events, aka long jump, high jump and triple jump. Again, really high force requirement. Sprinting into a jump, two extremely powerful exercises. Performance differences are larger than 20% are generally present when considering sports and activities that involve extensive upper body contribution, because you can see from that chart earlier that upper body is where you see even greater. It was, I think, 40%, whereas lower body was about 30%. So 10% difference in an already large gap. Now, fun fact, the gaps between fastest recorded baseball pitches and field hockey drag flicks exceed 50% between males and females. So you can see there again, huge power contribution, meaning a big difference. So the performance gap is known to be substantial in sports such as hammer and javelin, again, power sports. And in fact, throwing represents the widest sex difference in motor performance from an early age. In Olympic javelin throwers, this is manifested in the differences in peak linear velocity of the shoulder, wrist, elbow, hand, all of which are 13 to 20% higher for male athletes compared with female ones. Now, the increasing performance gap between males and females as upper body strength becomes more critical for performance, as I've said, is likely explained by the larger extent by the observation that males have a disproportionately greater strength in their upper compared to lower body, while females show the inverse. You can just see from the female structure, very slight upper bodies, and then usually just more mass around the lower body. And then men, you can still have a lot of mass in the lower body, but they just tend to be top heavier naturally. This difference distribution of strength components, the generally advantage of increased muscular mass in the body. Dominant disciplines. Males also have longer arms than females, which also allows for greater torque production from the arm lever when, for example, throwing a ball, punching or pushing. And that's just, well, if you've ever tried to loosen something like a bolt and you have a small spanner and you're like, this is really hard, and then you get a breaker bar out, or you just get a bigger pipe and you put it over, and suddenly it's super easy because it's force times distance. And if you've got a long arm and you produce however much force at the shoulder joint, well, if you're already producing greater force at that shoulder joint, and then the distance from that shoulder joint to the ball, which is in your hand, is greater, then that's just magnifying the discrepancy. Now, as I mentioned before, the predominant argument around how you could allow transgender females to compete within the female category, testosterone suppression, and whether that can eliminate the male advantage. In short, no. But let's go on. Let's look into it. So, work by Guren and colleagues, published in 2004, so way back when, reported the effects of 1 and 3 years of testosterone suppression and estrogen supplementation in 19 transgender women aged 18 to 37. After the first year of therapy, testosterone levels were reduced to 1 nanomole per litre, well within the typical female reference ranges, and remained low throughout the study course. As determined by MRI, thigh muscle area had decreased by 9% from baseline measurements. After 3 years, thigh muscle area had decreased by a further 3% from the baseline measurements, total loss of 12% over 3 years of treatment. However, when compared with the baseline measurements of thigh muscle area in transgender men who are born female and experience female puberty, transgender women retain significantly higher thigh muscle size. The final thigh muscle area after 3 years of testosterone suppression was 13% larger than trans women than in trans men at baseline. So the authors then concluded that testosterone suppression in transgender women does not reverse muscle size in female levels. So obviously the trans men had obviously gone on like testosterone supplementation and still couldn't meet that level of men. Why is that? Probably because of the things mentioned before, in the sense of that, like, your femur and like your actual skeleton isn't going to change if you go on to testosterone at the age of like 25. So you're not going to be able to pack on the same muscle mass if you're a 5'6" biological female as a 6'2" biological male who has gone through puberty. Now, obviously, even with suppression and everything, it's just simply there's more muscle to erode, or there's less skeleton to pack the muscle on. So, from longitudinal studies, the collected evidence suggests that 12 months, which is most commonly examined intervention period of testosterone suppression to female typical reference levels, results in a modest, approximately 5% loss of lean body mass or muscle size, for lack of a better word. No study has reported muscle loss exceeding the 12% found by Guren and Bunk after 3 years of therapy. Notably, studies have found very consistent changes in lean mass using dual energy X-ray absorptionometry after 12 months of treatment, where the changes has always been between 3 and 5% on average, with slightly greater reductions in the arm compared with the leg region. thus giving the large baseline differences in muscle mass between the males and females of approximately 40%. The reduction achieved by 12 months of testosterone suppression can reasonably be assessed as small relative to the initial superior mass. They therefore concluded across these studies that the muscle mass advantage males possess over females and the performance implications thereof are not removed by the currently studied durations of 4 months, 1 year, 2 years, and 3 years of testosterone suppression in transgender women. In sports where muscle mass is important for performance, inclusion is therefore only possible if a large imbalance in fairness and potentially safety in some sports is to be tolerated, which obviously we don't want to tolerate. We'll get onto this because the philosophical point is about to be said, but we're finished with, in general, longitudinal data presents a clear pattern of very modest to negligible changes in muscle mass and strength in transgender women, suppressing testosterone for at least 12 months. Muscle mass and strength are key physical parameters that constitute a significant, if not majority, portion of male performance advantage, most notably in those sports where upper body strength, overall strength, and muscle mass are crucial determinants of performance. Thus, our analysis strongly suggests that the reduction in testosterone levels required by many sports federations' transgender policies is insufficient to remove or reduce the male advantage in terms of muscle mass and strength by any meaningful degree. The relatively consistent findings of a minor, roughly 5% muscle loss after the first year of treatment is also in line with studies on androgen deprivation therapy in males with prostate cancer, where the annual loss of lean body mass has been reported to be a range of 2 to 4%. So, look, I think in some instances what can bamboozle people when they're listening or looking into it is you hear maybe a 5 to 10% reduction in muscle mass. And to be honest, if you were an athlete and you heard, someone took a supplement or someone had an injury or someone has a autoimmune disease that resulted in 10% reduction in their muscle mass, you'll go, they're never going to be competitive again. Or you'll be like, that's going to have to try hard to bounce back from that. But that's within their own category. If someone had an advantage of 40% over the rest of the field and then lost 10%, people would be like, I'm still 30% stronger. So what does he have to worry about? He could go sit on a beach for the next 4 years, come back for the Olympic year and still win. And that's where the problem arises. It is important to consider that when these percentage decreases in total muscle mass are eroded, that you still keep in mind the relative advantage that is still maintained over the cis female population. That is what is key. Not comparing transgender women to men, but comparing them to females, biological females. So this leads us to, is it fair to ban transgender women from the female category in sport? Scientific and a philosophical question, as this podcast episode has been titled. Now is time for the philosophical question. So, going through all this research and science, it is somewhat leads us to ending with, the question, is it fair that transgender females are excluded from competition in the female category in various sports? Well, let's start by asking what the purpose is of the female category and why it exists in the first place. If you have been listening to the podcast, then you should be thinking it is to allow women to compete without the presence of male advantage. Now, which is clearly evident, right? I mean, it is pretty clear. I know I've only given brief examples and percentages and it's quite hard to follow, but let's take a look at track and field and some weightlifting before we go any further. So, the women's result in the 100 meters is 10.71 seconds. Pretty fast. But the men's result is 9.69. Right? 9.69. A whole second. 10% difference. That's what 10% looks like. The best boys' result, so I believe this is 18 or under 18s, is 10.15. So boys are still faster than fully grown women. 200 meters, you're looking at 21.77 for females, 19.77 for men, so it jumps up to 20%. Still 10%-ish. 400 meters, 49.46 for women, 43.62. So you can see it's just kind of continuing that way. Once you get up to 5,000 meters, so the 5K, you got 14.18.37 minutes, 14 minutes, 18 seconds, and 37 milliseconds, whatever. Men, 12 minutes 55. Then we get onto things like high jump, and you've got 2.06 meters for females, 2.4 meters for men. Get down to triple jump, and you're looking at 14.96 for women, 18.11 for men. Now, if we get onto weightlifting, where you see big differences. So I've picked in the female category, the 76 kilo category, and then the closest I could get for men, I went down because I didn't want to go up. I wanted to go down if I had to, 73 kilos. The snatch, 124 kilos for women, 169 for men. Clean and jerk, 156 for women, 198 for men. And the record for the total is 278 for women, 364 for men. Almost 100 kilograms greater. These are big differences. Like, that is a gap that you can't make up. You will never... The running represents a really, really good example. Because you could be a man who is, 24 years old, 25 years old, physical prime, and you could be running 10.5 seconds, right? 10.5 seconds. You're not even faster than the fastest boys, right? And you're almost a second off the fastest men. 1 entire second, right? You're nowhere to be seen. You're not being invited to anything. You're not even being invited to regional meets, I don't think. I mean, excuse me if I'm incorrect, because I don't know that great, but 1 second is pretty big. But then you decide that you want to transition. You become a female, right? You transition over and you enter female sport. Suddenly, you are the fastest woman going by 0.2 of a second. Okay? You smash the record. Is it fair that you are allowed... Is it fair that you have been granted an audience on the world stage at the highest level, that you are now one of the greatest female, or should I say greatest athletes in history, okay, only because you had transitioned? But before you transitioned, you were just one of, you were fast. You were fast. There's no getting around it. You were fast. But you're not changing the history books by any means. That's the way I look at it. If you're an elite male, so you run a 9.75, okay, and then you transition, I think you've got two options. Either you retain the male advantage, stay on the level of testosterone, identify as being a female, but compete within the male/open category, and maybe win a gold. Depending on the conditions, depending who turns up, maybe you get a bit faster, you could win a gold. You might not break the world record, but you could win a gold. Or just a medal in general. But if you went down to the female category, suddenly you're the greatest ever by a long way. I think you should remain in that category. I think it makes sense to do so. So, in that instance, the moral, ethical, fairness argument is they should be able to compete within the category that they identify with. But I don't think the female category doesn't exist necessarily because women want to compete with other women because they don't like men, right? Or because they identify with that group. It is so they can compete at a high level without the presence of male advantage. Because they don't possess it. They don't possess male advantage. Just like anti-doping exists so that all athletes can compete without the presence of a doping advantage, right? And to some extent you could argue that, some bodybuilding and weightlifting competitions have a untested pool, which allows people to compete untested, so basically allowing them to be on some kind of drugs. But no one necessarily says, it's unfair that this doper is forced to either compete within that category without the presence of being tested. You just tell them, well, look, if you're good enough to compete in the tested category, then compete there and compete clean. The same should go for people transitioning from male to female. It's just a category. Effectively, the way of looking at it is, you could say the open category is for people who've benefited from testosterone throughout their development and continue to benefit from it. Not necessarily male and female. Whereas the female category is for people who haven't benefited from the developmental enhancements of testosterone through their, do you call it pubic years? During their pubic development, like while they're going through puberty and continue to not benefit from that. That's it. It also allows for the competition to be changed. So like the Tour de France or a Grand Tour, you still want good racing. So maybe you shorten the stages because just the female endurance system / how long they can ride for and still go out in breakaways and attacks and so on and so forth just needs a shorter stage. You still do 3 weeks. You still have the same physical challenge relative to one another, and you still have good racing in both. If you suddenly mix them, then you basically have women getting spat out the back because the performance difference is there. So that's the philosophical argument. That's the different approaches that people can take. I'm still, after producing this, on the side that I think it makes perfect sense to have two categories, of which one has not benefited from testosterone through development, aka the female category, biologically female category, and then the open category, which is just anyone else. Simply put, it is just anyone else who's benefited from testosterone during development and does or does not continue to benefit real time. Which arguably, even if you're suppressing testosterone, you still are benefiting because your skeleton's not going to get eroded away because you're not going to get shorter. So that's my opinion. Now, take it for what you want. I'll be really interested to hear feedback, comments, what other people think. You can do that by emailing the VO2 Lounge, which is THEVO2, the number 2, Lounge, which is LOUNGE @gmail.com. That's where you can submit any feedback, any comments. You can also comment on the VO2 Lounge website. If you enjoyed the episode, best way to show the support is, other than commenting, is leave a rating of the podcast and share it with your friends. The best way for the podcast to grow is just for you to tell a friend that you heard this episode and thought it was great. So with that, I will see you all in the next episode.